Hidden in the mountains of South America, surrounded by jungle, is the ruin of an ancient city. It is one of many which were abandoned when the great prehistoric empire of the Incas was destroyed by the Spanish conquerors. Long before the white men of Europe discovered the Western Hemisphere, there were early civilizations believed to have been developed in North and Central America. About 3,000 years ago, one group of these early people may have journeyed southward, possibly by sea, and settled in South America. Centuries later, the groups remaining in the north progressed to form the civilizations of the Mayas and Aztecs, but by this time contact between the continents appears to have been lost. For the people of the south developed a different kind of culture. Later, they became known as the Incas. Historians are not certain about these origins, but the best available evidence supports this theory. The Inca Empire had its center in the Peruvian Andes. Its most rapid growth began about 1100 AD. By 1530, the Incas had spread along about 2,500 miles of coast. Their empire included most of what are now the countries of Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and also smaller portions of Colombia, Argentina, and Chile. Compared to the United States of America, the Inca Empire was about this size. The population of the United States is about 140 million persons. That of the Incas was probably about 20 million. The greatest numbers lived on the high Andean plateaus of Peru and Ecuador. Some of their ancient cities have been found in the mountains, but many more remain hidden in the dense undergrowth. The Incas were expert stoneworkers. Their material was often hard granite. It was probably cut and shaped with other stones, for the Incas did not have hard metals like iron and steel, nor any machinery, nor even know the use of the wheel. And yet accurate stonework was accomplished without mechanical aids. No mortar was used, yet in some religious buildings, the stones were so carefully fitted that even today, after centuries of destructive force by weather and earthquake, a knife blade cannot fit in the crack between them. This is the entrance to a courtyard in a small mountain village. The Incas often placed a stone ring above such doorways and built stone pegs into the walls on each side. These were used in fastening a log barricade over the opening. This drawing shows how the lower end was held by a hole in the ground and the upper portion tied to the ring and pegs. Rafters for the roofs may have been tied to such stone projections. The ancient cities are roofless now, but once buildings were covered with thatch, like this one which has been restored. Terraces were sometimes needed to provide level ground for raising food. Projecting stones often formed steps for climbing the terraces. These stone boxes were fountains, bringing water to each terrace level. The water started at mountain springs and drained from one fountain to the next. The water is still running in many of these Inca fountains, although they have been abandoned for many hundreds of years. This odd stone may have been used in the study of astronomy. This entire room was hollowed out of solid rock. It may have been a tomb. The exact purpose of many such things is uncertain, since the Incas were unable to write, and their history was handed down by inaccurate legends from father to son. The Incas built an extensive system of roads throughout their empire. Some were merely wide trails, climbing steeply to mountain villages, or crossing rivers on swinging suspension bridges. The main roads, however, were carefully built and often paved with stone. Many are still in use by today's descendants of the Incas. A modern highway following an old Inca road passes the ruin of a rest house called a tambo. They were shelters for Inca travelers. Messages could be carried 100 miles a day by relay runners. Each covered the few miles between tambos, then gave his message to a fresh runner waiting there. Since the Incas never developed writing, messages were recorded on the quipus, a bundle of cords about 2 feet long. Groups of branching cords were colored and knotted. The colors and position and numbers of knots and cords gave a message. Use of the quipus was limited to the ruling classes. The Incas wove fine fabrics of the wool of plateau animals, the llama, alpaca, and vicuña. Inca skill in pottery making was also excellent. This necklace is made of coral beads. The Incas accumulated a great deal of gold and silver. It was used principally for ornament. This golden image of a dog was probably worn from a necklace. Most pieces of jewelry were hollow. This golden head ornament was worn by an Inca ruler. Beside it are ornamental golden feathers and bracelets. These priceless treasures were found very recently in an ancient tomb. These drawings show how the central square of Cusco, the Inca capital, probably looked. Under the Inca government, the people owned nothing but their own clothing. The land, its crops and minerals, and what the people manufactured belonged to the ruling Inca. His representatives divided all the goods among the people as they saw fit. There was no money, since nothing was owned by the people and therefore nothing could be purchased. Gold and silver was useful mainly as ornament, most of it concentrated here in Cusco. Many doorways were made of solid gold. Niches in the walls contained golden ornaments, and plates of gold hung on the outer walls of the Temple of the Sun. Inside the temple was a huge golden replica of the sun. A doorway in the east wall allowed the rising sun to strike this golden image. Seated in golden chairs along one wall were the mummified bodies of the previous rulers, wearing the clothes and ornaments they preferred in life. Across from them were the mummies of their queens. All this gold was the accumulation of centuries, but now this magnificence is gone. Stories of Inca wealth reached the ears of the Spaniards. In the early 1500s, they had crossed the Atlantic and conquered the Aztecs and Mayas of Central America. In search of more gold, an expedition under Francisco Pizarro sailed to what is now Peru and climbed the Andes. They numbered less than 200 men, but by capturing the Inca ruler, Atahualpa, they assumed control of the empire with very little struggle. At Cusco, the Spaniards stripped the gold and silver from the temples and destroyed most of the city. Later, the conquerors rebuilt most of Cusco in their own style. Christian churches have replaced temples once dedicated to sun worship. The wall under these arches was part of the Temple of the Sun. Spanish plazas mark where the Incas had gardens or public squares. The Spaniards built a church where the Inca ruler had his residence. It became the University of Cusco in 1862. The Spaniards often built on Inca foundations that withstood Cusco's destruction. Inca walls often have a second story above them, built of clay bricks by modern plateau people. Although over 400 years old, Inca workmanship remains far stronger and more attractive than recent construction. The snake design indicates that this wall was probably part of an Inca temple. This square doorway was built by the Incas. The arches were built by the early Spaniards. Modern Indians have filled in the space between them with crude clay bricks. Most descendants of the Incas still speak the Indian dialects of their forefathers, although the official language of the modern Andean countries, Spanish, is often heard in the cities. The Cathedral of Cusco is on the exact spot where the Incas had their temple to Viracocha, their god of creation. The Spaniards built the cathedral of the stones from the destroyed Inca temple. These crude carvings were made by very early Spanish colonists. Cusco is a strange blending of old and new. In front of the old cathedral, built of even more ancient building blocks, is a telephone pole, and at its foot a modern gasoline pump to supply the autos of present-day Cusco. The empire of the Incas is almost forgotten by the present-day people of the plateau. Brown-skinned natives whose forefathers may have been Inca rulers mingle with white-skinned natives whose forefathers came as conquerors with Francisco Pizarro. Modern Indians walk among the ruined temples of their ancestors without knowing when or why they were built. A great empire dissolved under Spanish occupation, leaving little behind it except ruined cities hidden in the mountains where once lived the Incas, ancients of the Andes.
A curious, mysterious fear now seized the people, for there had been numerous signs in the sky: lightning, comets, an eagle pursued by a flock of buzzards. The soothsayers predicted an avalanche of calamities from which neither the empire nor the royal line would ever recover. Then, as Huayna Capac, the 12th Inca, lay dying, he prophesied the arrival of a new, hitherto unknown people who would conquer his kingdom and become its absolute masters. Long before the Incas, long before the rise and fall of other pre-Columbian civilizations, there was the land. Soaring snow-capped peaks form the Andean Cordillera, the backbone of Peru. To the east stretch the lush, dense forests of the Amazon. Mysterious, thinly settled, it is a region still largely undeveloped and unexplored. Westward lies the Pacific, once an inviolate frontier. Bordering it for more than 1,000 miles runs a thin strip of sun-scorched desert, its arid wastes intercut by isolated valleys. Between the sea and the majestic Andes rise a steady succession of foothills, passes, basins, and high plains. The latter, often savage in their beauty, are the timeless grazing grounds of the llama and alpaca. It was from the harsh realities of his physical world that the ancient Peruvian evolved to hunt, to plant, to build his temples and his cities. Several thousand years more would elapse before they learned to grow and harvest simple food plants, such as beans, gourds, squash, and peppers. As the reliance on agriculture increased, there was a corresponding cultural progress. Man now had time between harvests for activities other than the production of food. It was during this formative period that religion would emerge as a unifying cultural force. The first important Andean culture, the Chavin, derives its name from an important ceremonial center in the northern highlands, Chavin de Huantar. Primarily a religious cult, this Chavin culture spawned a fanged god, half human, half feline, whose stylized aspects would later permeate much of Peruvian art. The decline of the Chavin culture, about 400 BC, near the time of the greatest heights of Greek civilization, resulted in the rise of a number of strong regional cultures, most notably the Paracas, the Mochica, and the Nazca. Mummies were entombed, wrapped in layers of exquisitely embroidered mantles, each a triumph of the textile art. Coastal grave sites were filled with pottery of amazing variety and beauty. The vigor and exuberance of these early cultures also found expression in the creation of enormous religious structures. The largest, the Temple of the Sun, was built by the Mochicas. It covered 8 acres at its base and is estimated to have contained more than 130 million sun-baked bricks. This golden age of integration and development would be followed by the somber, all-embracing culture of Tiahuanaco. On the wind-swept plains near Lake Titicaca, imposing ruins testified to a highly organized and powerful religious political movement. The severe Tiahuanacan style would spread throughout much of Peru, but the political influence of Tiahuanaco would end abruptly about the year 1000. The pressures of increased populations created violent competition for the sources of food production. As one group sought and gained control over another, there was a shift from rural to urban living. Chan-Chan, capital of the mighty Chimu Empire, covered an area of 11 square miles. Because of the dry climate, the intricate decorations of carved and molded mud have been miraculously preserved. Urbanization would also be a feature of the smaller kingdoms of the coast. Pachacamac, with its great temple pyramid, was one such metropolis. Another was the administrative center of Tambo, Colorado. Many of the adobe walls still retain traces of their original colors. The climax of these continuous and intensive power struggles was reached in the early 15th century with the inception of the Inca Empire. Within a few generations, the Incas would conquer and control all other peoples, thus completing a drama that had begun so many thousands of years before. What were the thoughts and aspirations of these men long dead? What were their customs, their rituals, their myths? These are questions that becloud a full understanding of the ancient Peruvians. They left no written record, so we are obliged to search elsewhere for clues to their identity. Although looting in Peru is as old as the conquest, careful archaeological excavation is relatively recent. Yet within the space of only a few decades, extraordinary progress has been made in the study of pre-Columbian man. It is often the smaller objects that best express the Indian's innate sense of beauty. Even on the everyday products of his existence, he lavished skill and artistry. Working within the confines of strict and formal idioms, he was often able to achieve the miraculous, a highly individual blending of form, design, and color. The potter's wheel was unknown to the ancient Peruvian. Articles were shaped by hand or cast in molds. They were decorated, ornamented, incised, or engraved with subject matter that ranged from abstract patterns of religious symbolism to completely realistic representations of people, plants, animals, and birds. Women were chiefly responsible for the weaving. Employed Employing every known technique, and some as yet unexplained, they produced magnificent textiles whose colors still glow after being buried for centuries in the dry sand. Metals and alloys were worked into articles of great delicacy and sophistication. Gold was esteemed for its beauty and permanence, but was not used as money. It symbolized the sun, a god, and was therefore beyond value. The arts of the ancient Peruvian are among the glories of the Americas. So intense and clear was his expression, so honest and immediate his vision, that we are able centuries later to feel the very pulse of his existence. In his hands, the past becomes the present. All that had taken place before would culminate in the dazzling empire of the Incas. Their capital was Cusco, navel of the world, the center from which all vitality and authority radiated. A model of city planning. At one time, some 200,000 persons lived in its complex of temples, palaces, sanctuaries, and private dwellings. The more important buildings were constructed of beautifully fitted granite blocks. The walls of many can be seen even today, where they were incorporated into later Spanish structures. Such was the capital's prestige that it was said, an Indian who was going to Cusco always stood aside when meeting an Indian coming from the city. Imperial, divine Cusco. It stunningly embodied the order, the power, the mystique of the Inca world. The Inca genius became transfixed in stone. Supremely confident of their civilization, they built ceaselessly, unhesitatingly, and for all time. Sacsayhuaman, the brooding fortress overlooking Cusco, was a direct result of the power and authority of the Inca social system. Thousands of Indians labored for decades to quarry, shape, and move the Cyclopean stones, which they likened to earth, crystallized and put into geometrical form. Whatever the Incas touched became ordered, logical, altogether functional. For example, they never constructed walled villages. Instead, they built defense units containing fortresses, temples, and barracks. Agricultural terraces made some of the defense units completely self-sustaining. All was ruled with mathematical precision. Sites were laid out by professional architects sent from Cusco. Houses of the common people were generally clustered into groups near the Acropolis, where they could seek protection in time of danger. Once upon a time. From these legendary beginnings, the children of the sun extended and consolidated their empire, until in time it would be comparable to Caesar's. It was called Tawantinsuyo, which in Quechua means land of the four corners of the world. Roads linked the land north and south. Every few miles there was a post house, erected to provide lodgings for the official traveler. An elaborate courier service, using trained runners, for the horse was still unknown, provided rapid communications with even the most distant provinces. The economy of the Incas stemmed from the land and its products. 1/3 belonged to the sun, or state religion. 1/3 was the property of the Inca, who was the state. And the remaining third was owned and worked collectively by the common people. They formed the base of a gigantic social pyramid. Next in line were state officials and their families, followed by nobles of the royal blood. Ruling over the whole of this wondrous edifice was the Sapa, or Supreme Inca. There were many reasons for the Inca success as imperialists, but perhaps the most important was their sense of mission. It was embodied in those words of easy pacification. Amamancha chiku ichu nyoka Inca kani. Fear not, for I am an Inca. In 1527, the empire suddenly found itself with two Incas contending for the throne, Atahualpa and Huáscar. A bitter civil war ensued that greatly weakened the empire. Plagues and prophecies added further to the despair and irresolution of the populace. And then on November 16th, 1532, it would all come to an end. With the capture of Atahualpa, death, famine, and destruction became man's common lot. Silence reigns at Machu Picchu, its sleep of centuries barely disturbed by its discovery a few decades ago. Ferns and wild strawberries grow among the steps and terraces. Lichens coat the stones with gray and green patinas. Nature is patient. She can wait to reclaim what is rightfully hers. The clouds lift, and for a moment we are struck by an overpowering sensation of a vista stretching far back, filled with the specters of the past. For here, man lived and dreamed and died in splendid isolation. It is then that Machu Picchu becomes more than just an Inca ruin. It becomes a symbol of all the vanished peoples of the Andes who lived out their lives untouched by the sweep and panoply of world history. It is then that Machu Picchu becomes a majestic confirmation of man's ability to move from darkness unto light.
The Earthen Kingdom, Chan Chan Archaeological Zone. The Chan Chan Archaeological Zone is in the desert area of Peru. It's the site of remains of the Chimu Kingdom, which thrived between the 13th and 15th centuries. Numerous palaces were built by successive kings. The city is spread over an extensive area. The buildings were made of adobe bricks. Adobe is easily eroded. The site was simultaneously inscribed in 1986 on the World Heritage List and the World Heritage in Danger List. Each palace complex has a temple and a square and forms a small town. This is the king's treasure house. The holes in the adobe blocks help air to circulate through the corridors. This building was 3 meters high when it was built. The rooms stored offerings to the king. There was no system of writing in the Chimu Kingdom. The reliefs here are thought to represent the type of items stored in the room. The seabird represents sea produce. The room with the moon was used to store gold and jewelry for the king. The gold and silver items excavated at the site are remarkable for their intricate decoration. They reflect a high level of skill among Chimu craftsmen. This artifact includes a figure of the Chimu king represented in white. These are maracas players. Here a flute player. The king is attending a banquet. Explanation for the Chimu king's success can be found in these ditches running across the field. They're the remains of irrigation channels. The Chimu kings brought snowmelt water from the Andes and converted an arid desert into a green oasis. People harvested cotton and corn in these fields. The kingdom also gained from proximity to the ocean. Local fishermen still use straw-made boats. They kneel on the boat. The same image can be seen carved in stone. The boat in the relief is surrounded by marine life. It also shows how fish were caught. The Chimu people use their natural resources. Much about their lives still remains to be discovered. Efforts to preserve the World Heritage Site here will continue alongside efforts to unravel the mysteries of an ancient culture.